nation. In your name, Jesus. Amen. Okay. Tell me, are we on? Yes. Okay. So welcome for those watching at home. I'm excited about this evening. You're going to learn some things. I learned some things preparing for this. You're going to find out one thing I learned that's really, I think, just really interesting and neat. And then another thing that's interesting, kind of par for the course, but it also will help us to understand what we're up against, okay, in terms of the restoration process and project of restoring from lost to found. The lost history of our nation, which has been found. I'm helping to find it and give it to y'all so that you can share it with others. I'm also excited because you're going to get to know some characters, some individuals that you might never have even heard of or known in terms of their personal lives. Because tonight I'm going to read from a number of letters that were written by people to other people that is going to help to illuminate these people's lives, which I think are just really exciting. But first, let's go back a little bit. The whole establishment of the United States is based on that 1607 Cape Henry entering into a covenantal relationship with God for this nation. We discussed that. Then we took a look at the first miracle that happened in 1746, where the answered prayer enabled the eastern colonies to be saved from the French onslaught, that armada that was sent over here, where it ended up not being one shot fired at all. And then we last week took a look at three actually defeats that George Washington experienced at the beginning of his military career. That, I mean, if you watch the Super Bowl, okay, this last Sunday, let me put it in that context. If you mention the name Buffalo Bills, you're going to remember a name of a kicker by the last name of Norwood, who in 3 Super Bowls missed kicks, and they ended up losing all the Super Bowls. So generally, if you have negative things about you one after another, it ends up being real negative. I don't think he's going to make it to the Hall of Fame. But on the other hand, with George Washington, he suffered 3 defeats, but each time his recognition grew until the point, as we saw last week with the Battle of Monongahela, how he ended up, because of the supernatural nature where there was defeat all around him, how he was viewed in terms of the protection of God in that situation was part of him being elevated to the point where we're going to get to tonight. Tonight we're going to take, just briefly, I want to follow up with George Washington, because he's then going to meet an individual that I will guarantee you, the final quote that I give tonight, or the next to final quote, you would have never guessed how important this individual, Henry Knox, was to the American Revolution and beyond that. So let's start by talking about what happened with George Washington after the events of 1753, 1754, 1755 we discussed last week. He would continue to serve the British in terms of in the military until 1758. At that point, he would retire, go back to Mount Vernon. The next year, 1759, he would get married to a woman by the name of Martha Washington, okay? And he would then, while there, from 1758-59, right up to 1775, he would become a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, Mount Vernon, Virginia. The House of Burgesses, a Burgess was simply an inhabitant. That's what it means, inhabitant. And historically, coming over from England, the Burgesses were the inhabitants of boroughs, not cities, not towns, boroughs. So that's what it was called, the House of Burgesses in Virginia. That was the first House of Burgesses ever established here on our continent, and it was established by the British, so it was controlled by the British. However, as time would go on towards the Revolution, more and more of it would be channeled towards grievances that the founders had towards England, English rule, what was happening here on our continent. He would be meeting with the likes, okay? They were our they would be the colonial representation. This body would be the colonial representation in the court of England. Okay, we would come up with our things. We'd take orders from them and back and forth during that time. He would be there with the likes of his compadres. Okay, those that were with him would be Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, George Mason. So some of the most prominent people of that time and the prominent thinkers of that time were in that Virginia House of Burgesses. And that's, like I said, where he would be functioning for, over a dozen years. Then, on April 19, 1775, British regulars, a British regular was simply their professional military. The British regulars and colonial militia met face-to-face on Lexington Green in Lexington, Massachusetts. And you know what that was all about? That is what was called the shot heard around the world. That actually came into vogue, that term, shot heard around the world, the beginning of the American Revolution on Lexington Green when the British and the colonials met face-to-face. No one to this day knows who fired the first shot. Just look it up. There's conjecture who fired it, but nobody knows for sure. That would start the American Revolution. And it was called the shot heard around the world by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So that wasn't until the 1830s when he would, looking back on it, called it that. That shot that was heard around the world, which is a reality, at that time. Then 1 month later in June, on June 17th, 1775, the British fleet determined to bombard the American soldiers on a New England hill called Bunker Hill. So we've got a slide for that, if we can show that at this point. Okay, so Bunker Hill is where? Right there. Bunker Hill is right there. And also tonight we're going to be looking down here at Worcester Heights right there. So Worcester Heights and Bunker Hill are prominent in the American Revolution at this period of time. And actually the majority of what happened right next to it on Bratz Hill, right over here, or Breed's Hill, Breed's Hill. Okay, so these two areas will be of prominence tonight. And the reason that those two will be prominent is that they were the most highly elevated areas there around Boston. Back then, it was Boston and Charlestown. Now, Charlestown still exists today, but only as a suburb of Boston. It was incorporated into Boston. But again, the thing you need to remember, what it doesn't show is what is happening right out here, because this, you can see Gage and Howe, 10,000, that means 10,000 persons in their ships. They're blocking the harbor since 1773, which was the Boston Tea Party. Tensions were growing that moved to the point of Lexington Green, but the tensions are growing. It breaks out in war, and as a result of that, then the British surround the harbor, put in the Intolerant Acts that we talked about last week, and things are going to get more and more tense, during this period of time. Okay, so let me repeat that. 1 month later, on June 17, 1775, the British fleet determined to bombard American soldiers at Bunker Hill, which guards the north entrance to the harbor. The English discovered, this is so interesting to me, as they're preparing to this bombardment of basically Boston, they find out that they have the wrong size cannonballs. You go, how in the world? Somehow, in their preparations to leave, there's different size cannons. Whoever loaded it with the wrong cannonballs. Okay, so now they're going to disregard a naval bombardment, and instead what they're going to do is, because of that, they will send 2,300 soldiers with bayonets fixed up Bunker Hill. Now, this is a very important point in the battles that are going to happen for another reason of a defeat becoming a victory. They're going to the English are going to send the 2,300 people up Bunker Hill, and they're going to be repelled twice. It'll take the third time for them to finally take Bunker Hill. In that process, the British will lose 1,000 men, and these are rough numbers, but 1,000 men, and the American colonials will lose 500. What that did was it instilled within the American colonists the belief now, hey, we can fight with these guys. So they lose Bunker Hill, okay, at this point, but it actually ends up being favorable to them. The same day, in 1775, that this takes place at Bunker Hill, something's happening in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The Continental Congress is meeting, and they are choosing George Washington based on all these things that we've seen up to this point, added to that in his personal life in that, 14-year period, I believe. He was in the House of Burgesses. Because of the reputation all the way up to this point, they chose George Washington to be in charge of the entire military. Okay? He is now going to head for Bunker Hill. That's his first part of his commission. Head to Bunker Hill because things are breaking out there. All right? Okay, so he comes to 300 miles to Philadelphia, and on the way he writes a letter to his wife Martha. Now, these letters I'm going to read tonight, I think, give us great insight into these individuals. Also, I want to say this. People argue that, hey, we're not a Christian, we weren't formed as a Christian nation, and they'll say we're secular, that the people came over from England for diverse purposes, and that, like freedom of religion's part of it. And and what it is, it's totally non-contextual. One thing that I hope you get tonight as I read about these founders is that there is no doubt where they are coming from. And by the end of it, when you hear somebody say, well, we weren't based as a Christian nation, and so forth, you're going to see it's obviously totally non-contextual, totally false. But if you ask these people, why do you believe that, you're going to find out that whoever taught them American history taught it in a teaching form that would leave God out and would leave anything that relates to God and their faith out. There might be a little teeny two-word thing said, but they're going to leave out the most important thing, because without God seeing what happened in the American Revolution, you will never understand it. You just will never understand it, not factually. So I think you're going to see that very quickly. So George Washington writes his wife Martha as he is heading from Philadelphia to Bunker Hill, or Boston. Dearest Martha, quoting, it has been determined in Congress that the whole army raised for the defense of the American cause shall be put under my care, and that it is necessary for me to proceed immediately to Boston to take command. I shall rely, therefore, confidently on that providence which has heretofore preserved and been bountiful to me. So what's he talking about there? Where has God been bountiful and protecting of him? Battle of Monongahela, where 4 bullets went through his coat, where 2 horses were shot out from under him, the same place where the Indian chief would come later and proclaim to him that he knew that he was under the guardianship of the Great Spirit. So that's what he's speaking of there. Additionally, Governor John Trumbull of Connecticut wrote to George Washington, quote, the Honorable Congress have proclaimed a fast to be observed by the inhabitants of all the English colonies on this continent, to stand before the Lord in one day with public humiliation, fasting and prayer, to deplore our many sins, to offer up our joint supplications to God, that they have appointed you to possess the supreme director of all events, hath caused, speaking of George Washington, all events hath caused a wonderful union of hearts and counsels to subsist. Now, therefore, be strong and very courageous. May the God of the armies of Israel shower down the blessings of his divine providence on you, give you wisdom and fortitude, cover your head in the day of battle and danger, add success, and convince our enemies of their mistaken measures. So as this unfolds, you've seen all these major players, including governors, including George Washington. You're going to see it from Henry Knox. They're all seeing or understanding what is happening from the perspective of God, And then they're writing to each other, expressing, as you'll see, what they have seen, and that their encouragement comes from what God is doing, which then enters us into the miraculous story of Henry Knox. Henry Knox was born in Boston, Massachusetts, July 25th, 1750. He lived with 9 siblings, as well as his mother and father. His father, though, abandoned his family when Henry was 9 years old. To support his brother and younger brother, to support his mother, and younger brother, Henry left school at 9 years of age and began working in a local bookbindery. With unbounded access to a host of books, he focused on his passion of military strategy and weaponry. He pored over books like Julius Caesar's commentaries, where he learned how to design fortifications, situate entrenchments, and discern topographical advantages, becoming a competent engineer and military tactician. Okay, is everybody with me here? Later, he opened a bookstore. He named the London Bookstore. His store was frequented by John Adams. In 1775, Adams recommended the 25-year-old Knox for a position in Washington's burgeoning Continental Army. Now, I'm of the belief when things are happening with the Lord, there are no coincidences, just God incidences. As we get further in this, you can look back and see, wow, John Adams, who will become George Washington's vice president in the first administration of the new United States. Okay? If John Adams had not frequented that store and seen this young man, he's older now, he's no longer 9, he's got his own bookstore, he's about 25 years of age. If there hadn't have been that meeting, would Henry Knox ever been involved like he was, or ever been put in a position to serve as he did? I really don't think so. I think it was John Adams. The reason why? The 25-year-old Knox, John Adams in 1775 recommends the 25-year-old Knox for a position in Washington's burgeoning Continental Army. After his first encounter with George Washington in July of 1775, Knox was quick to sing the praises of his future officer and friend, marveling at George Washington's ability to, quote, fill his place with vast ease and dignity and dispense happiness around him. Now, as Christians, we might say that's his what? Anointing. When he would walk into a room, it says he would generate happiness, and everyone was at ease as he moved into the room. General Washington appointed Knox to the rank of colonel. With ongoing skirmishes, Captain Henry Knox approached, remember they're at Boston, they're at Charlestown, they're at Bunker Hill, okay? With ongoing skirmishes, Henry Knox approached Washington with an idea to fortify the Americans' position. In response to his idea, on December 1st, 1775, Washington sent Colonel Knox to Fort Ticonderoga to bring 59 cannons to Boston to drive out the British. So let's go to the next one here. Is that the? No, let's go to the next one. There we go. Here's what's going to happen. Here we are in Boston, and Henry Knox comes to George Washington and makes a suggestion. He wants to go up to Fort Ticonderoga, up here in New York. It's still in New York, okay? And he's going to bring back over 50 cannons. Now, why were those cannons there? Because back in 1759, during the French and Indian War, the British defeated the French at Fort Ticonderoga, and the cannons that were there had been left there. Now we got, 15 years or whatever. The cannons are still there. So Henry Knox gives a suggestion to leave Boston, go up there, get the cannons, come back down, and I think you can understand that in this time it's not going to be the easiest of traversing that kind of terrain of mountains and streams and so forth to get there and come back, okay? But let's see what happens. Knox and his men arrived at Fort Ticonderoga December 5th, 1775. They began the 300-mile trek back to Boston, loading the available cannons on big, flat-bottomed boats and rowed them through freezing weather to the southern end of Lake George. There, the cannons were dragged across the snow. Let's show that other picture that we started with today. The one with them dragging them across. There we go. Here the cannons were dragged across the snow. As he reported to Washington on December 17, 1775 in a letter, quote, I have made 42 exceedingly strong sleds, like that, and have provided 80 yoke of oxen to drag them as far as Springfield, where I shall get fresh cattle to carry them. I hope in 16 or 17 days to be able to present your excellency a noble train of artillery. On December 17th, 1775, Knox wrote a letter to his wife Lucy sharing this ordeal and affectionately closes. This is going to give you an insight into the man here, okay? This is written to his wife Lucy. This is Henry Knox's letter. He closes with this, quote, may he who holds the hearts of all flesh in his hands. Who's he talking about? Yeah, okay. So may he who holds the hearts of all flesh in his hands incline America to put their sole confidence in him, and then he will still continue to be their leader. And may he condescend to take particular care and give special directions to your guardian angel. Okay? Then he closes with this. Concerning you, adieu, my only love, for the present adieu, Henry. So I read that, I go, that's kind of a weird ending. I mean, what's he doing there? Especially, when you're just said, I pray that God's will give directions to your guardian angel. But then he says, concerning you, adieu, my only love, for the present, adieu. And then signs it Henry. And so I'm thinking about that. I can't find anything on it. So I say, you know what, I'm going to look up that word adieu. I know it's French, but let me look it up. And guess what adieu means? It means goodbye, but that's not its original meaning. Its original meaning in the French is, I commit you to God. So he's doing a play on words here. I believe what he's saying. I mean, it seems obvious to me what he's saying. Concerning you, I commit you to God, my only love, for the present, goodbye. Okay. So I think he's doing a play on words there. And you get that free of charge. But see, that's what comes out when you're studying. These things pop up, and you follow the rabbit into the hole, and sometimes you find things that you wouldn't normally see. And I think that's one of the beauties of studying. Knox arrived at the Hudson River, but the ice was not thick enough to support the sleds, and one sank. On January 8, 1776, Knox wrote in his diary of help provided by local farmers and pastors, quote, went on the ice about 8 o'clock in the morning and proceeded so carefully that before night we got over 23 sleds and were so lucky as to get the cannon out of the river, the one that had sunk, okay, owing to the assistance of the good people of the city of Albany. The 3-month endeavor of dragging the cannons over 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston was called by historian Victor Brooks, quote, one of the most stupendous feats of logistics. Knox finally arrived at Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the night of March 4th, 1776. The massive 3-month undertaking was complete without a moment to spare. A diversionary attack was made to distract the British while Washington's men wrapped wagon wheels with straw to muffle the noise and frantically move the cannons up to a strategic point on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston Harbor. So let's go now back to that map of Boston. And we're now down here, Worcester Heights. You can see here's the harbor, and this is where they're going to be placed. Remember, this is at the high point, so it's going to give the opportunity with our cannons to be shooting down on the ships and the boats as they come in, okay, to attack. All right? Okay. To make it appear even more impressive, and I find this quite humorous, Washington's men painted some logs to look like cannons and placed them alongside the real cannons overlooking the bay. Why? To make it seem more ominous, okay, that it would scare the British. The next morning, an astonished British general, William Howe, looked up at Dorchester Heights and remarked, quote, "The rebels did more in one night than my whole army would have done in 1 month." So he was duly impressed, okay? On March 6, 1776, from his Cambridge headquarters, General Washington ordered, quote, notice the days we're going there from the 4th to the 6th. Now we're at the 7th. Thursday the 7th, quote, "Being set apart by this province as a day of fasting, prayer, and humiliation, to implore the Lord and giver of all victory to pardon our manifold sins and wickedness, and that it would please him to bless the Continental Army with his divine favor and protection. All officers and soldiers are strictly enjoined to pay all due reverence and attention on that day to the sacred duties to the Lord of hosts for his mercies already received and for those blessings which our holiness and uprightness of life can alone encourage us to hope through his mercy obtain." So again, as this thing's unfolding, continually, they're calling for days of fasting. They're calling for prayer. They're asking them to confess their sins, to repent, 2 Chronicles 7:14, and to ask God for his mercies to continue and show them favor because they feel that what they're doing is just. Okay? On the same day, March 7th, British General Howe was assembling 3,000 troops to land and charge up Dorchester Heights. But, and here's the second act of providential care, the second part of the miracle. But a violent providential snowstorm arose, causing the sea to be too turbulent for the attack. On March 8th, General Howe sent word to Washington that if the British were allowed to leave Boston unmolested, they would not burn the city on their way out. So what's happening here? First of all, the cannons show up at the nick of time. Just it couldn't have been a day later. They show up, they rush as fast as they can. They try to keep it so that no one can hear the wheels turning by wrapping them. They get them up on the height, then they add the trees to it, waiting for the British. The British the next day or 2 days later they're gonna come up with their men, their militia. No, not their militia, their army. And all of a sudden the nor'easter comes, which is full of snow. Okay? Which is turbulence out in the water. What it does is it discourages them to the point where they're going to go home and fight another day. That's the miracle of what is happening here. 8 days passed, and on March 16, 1776, the Continental Congress approved without dissent a resolution by General William Livingston, bringing in a new party here. Quote, Congress, desirous to have people of all ranks and degrees duly impressed with a solemn sense of God's superintending providence and of their duty devoutly to rely on his aid and direction, so earnestly recommend a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer, that we may with united hearts confess and bewail our manifold sins and transgressions, and by sincere repentance and amendment of life, appease God's righteous displeasure, and through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ, obtained this pardon and forgiveness. End of quote. Now listen, these are the same guys that are going to be putting together the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So for somebody to say, well, didn't have anything to do with Christianity, with religion, it was for other purposes, but you see what they're writing and what they're doing and what they're perceiving about what's happening around about them, that is a totally fallacious approach to history that they're using. And generally it's by people that have never studied history, or the history they've studied is the one that's devoid of God. I'm going to give you proof to that in just a couple of minutes. The next day, March 17, 1776, British General Howe finally ordered his troops to board their ships and evacuate Boston. Sailing away with them were about 1,000 British loyalists. A British loyalist is someone living in the American colonies but doesn't want to secede from Britain, but wants to be stay under British control. But check this out. Sailing away with them were about 1,000 British loyalists, including the parents of Henry Knox's wife. So you can see, not only were the people on the battlefield making sacrifices, but the choices that they were making were even dividing families, okay? On March 31st, General Washington wrote his brother John Washington, quote, upon their discovery of the works next morning, speaking back to the night before the nor'easter, and then the nor'easter, great preparations were made for attacking them, but not being ready before the afternoon, and the weather getting very tempestuous, much blood was saved, and a very important blow prevented, that this most remarkable interposition of providence is for some wise purpose, I have not a doubt. In other words, God caused it to happen just that way for something in the future, he wrote. I don't know what it is, but I have no doubt that God's in control of this. As a result of Henry Knox's stupendous achievement, he was promoted to brigadier general. In a letter to John Adams, dated May 16, 1776, Knox revealed the lack of military knowledge amongst his officers, and that it was not due to their aversion to such knowledge, but due to a lack of books available to them. Now, who would better understand that than a bookbinder who then later owned a bookstore? Okay? So what is he saying there? He's saying it's not their fault. We do not have enough books that deal with war, and it's not getting in their hands. You got to understand, this is not a professional army that the colonials had. This is a bunch of they're described as a ragtag group of men who were fighting for liberty. But most of them were not educated. Even the officers, they had not have officer training. They had not been as well booked in terms of book learning as Henry Knox. But look what God did. Just look at the way that God set this up. By that meeting in his bookstore with John Adams. And John Adams then suggested Henry Knox to George Washington because he knew George Washington. And first of all, the suggestion to go to Fort Ticonderoga to bring back the cannons, and then by following it and doing it, he arrived just in the nick of time. God was controlling it. Then God sends a nor'easter, which frustrates the British. It's in the, I didn't even mention that. When Henry Knox was going up to Fort Ticonderoga, this is in the middle of winter. So he's run into all these weather conditions, including ice on the rivers and so forth. It is this knowledge, Knox's knowledge of war, that enabled the self-taught Knox to augment the Army's artillery arsenal to unrivaled heights, helping later to secure pivotal victories at the battles of Trenton and Princeton during the winter of 1776. Within that letter to John Adams, Knox makes an impassioned plea for both the availability of more books and the importance of the campaign for independence writing. Quote, such opportunities as the present do not often turn up in the course of human events. When I read that, I realized something. Here we are in what? We're in May of 1776. Where is this? Yeah, May 16th. June, July. The Declaration of Independence, then the Constitution is going to be written. Notice what he says. Such opportunities as the present do not often turn up in the course of human events. Does that sound familiar? In the course of human events. The future happiness of or misery, again, this is Henry Knox writing. The future happiness or misery of a great proportion of the human race is at stake. And if we make a wrong choice, ourselves and our posterity must be wretched. Wrong choice? There can be but one choice consistent with the character of a people possessing the least degree of reason, and that is to separate. To separate from that people who from a total disillusion of virtue among them must be our enemies, an event which I devoutly pray God may soon take place. Now, here's the second thing I discovered when doing this. One of the advantages I have, I can go back to the original documents, okay? And so here's what I found for this original document. This one is, it's the other one. Go to the second one. Okay. I devoutly pray. I better use something here. Here we go. Right there. That's the letter I. I. Then look at this. That's a D. D-E-V-O-U-T-L-Y. It's a double cross there, but it's devoutly. Pray, God may. Okay, you see that? Does everybody see those words there? This is important. First of all, what's important is to see that word devoutly. D-E-V-O-U-T-L-Y. Pray, God. G-O-D, may, and then it goes to the last line. I want to make sure I've got this right here. Okay, hold on. I just want to make sure. Hold on, everybody. Yeah, that's it. And pray. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I just didn't want to make a mistake on this. Okay, now go to the National Archives. We'll come back to this in a minute. Here's the same thing in the National Archives. And we didn't do the first part, but it's the same place. And then down here it says, an event which I devoutly. Notice that V there? Why did they do that? There's no doubt that that was a V, devoutly. Pray may soon take place. What's missing in that line? God. No, how can that happen? How can God? Because people today believe you can pray to trees. You can pray to other gods, but not capital G God. So an event which I devoutly pray may soon take place. An event which I devoutly pray God may soon take place. Now, here is the issue that's come about. Some people understand it, but in our nation right now, only 20 states include cursive writing. Okay? 30 of our states no longer do it from 1st to 6th grades. That's when it's introduced. If a people cannot read cursive writing, guess what? You cannot read the original documents. Matter of fact, it's difficult anyway. This is from the 1700s. Go back to the caption that I captured out of the original document. Look at that. They're writing. What are they writing with back then? Quills and ink, right? And since parchment paper is not easily obtained, especially during wartime, you notice what they're going to do. If I showed you more of it, there's cross-outs all the way through it. And that's how they sent it. They cross out what they didn't mean. They give it more thought. Then they write again, okay? And then you have the blurbs coming of ink when it's not perfect, right? And so this is a good one that you put up here. You see it, but notice the writing is different. The lettering is different in terms of what the letters that we have for F and S are different, okay, and so forth. So the point is, it's not easy enough to read the things. But if you haven't learned cursive writing, you cannot. You have to take the, what? Things like the National Archives. But if the National Archives and other organizations take out God, guess what happens? You lose the true history of the United States. And so this is, now I've got some good news. I don't want to just give you all bad news. Believe it or not, California is one of the 20 states that still has cursive writing. In 2010, because of Common Core, they took cursive writing out of California. But in 2023, AB Bill, I think it was 448, was introduced up at the Capitol in Sacramento, and it was passed and then later signed by Governor, who's our governor? Newsom, yes. Governor Newsom, he signed it into law, and so since really 2024, we've had cursive writing back in our schools here, which is a blessing. I wouldn't have predicted that, okay? But it's true, so I wanted to give you that good news too, okay? All right, so everybody understand what I'm saying is you have to be able to, well, I don't want to do that. You have to be able to read, and you have to be able to read cursive writing so that you don't lose your history. It's that simple. Now, I was asked in the first service, where are these found and all? Actually, either things like the Smithsonian Institute has a bunch, but also private individuals. For those that have been with us for a while with David Barton has the second largest collection of original documents like this of private individuals. And you can get access to them. The place I get these, you pay $25 to $100, whether you want it for a month or a year, and you get access. If you don't pay, you don't get access to them, okay? So the point is there are different ways to get it. And some of them are private individuals. Some of them are organizations like a Smithsonian Institute or others. And so they're kind of spread out. There's no one place that has them all. I remember, and I believe it was around 1986, I flew from here up to San Francisco to meet David Barton. We first had him here in 1985. And it had to be closer to 1990. Anyway, I flew up to San Francisco to meet him at the National Booksellers Convention. And we went around, and his approach is very simple. He would go up to the different booksellers and say, yes, do you have any original documents signed by anyone that signed the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Articles of Confederation, whatever, anything that had to do with the founding of our nation? So we went around. Nobody had anything until we finally found one gentleman. And he said, well, I do have one thing. I don't know if you'd be interested in it. It's the Last Will and Testament by Charles Carroll of Carrollton, signer of the Declaration. And so we looked at it, and guess what? In it is his personal testimony for Jesus Christ and sharing that with the family to come, which is tremendous. So that one item cost like $2,000, and Charles Carroll was not considered to be one of the big guys, okay, the John Adams, the George Washington, the Thomas Jefferson. But even that, they're very expensive. And but again, I had the blessing of being able to be with him and to actually see him procure that. And I've sent him some materials also that I found along the way. Okay, enough of that. Here we go. But to Henry Knox ascending to command, due to Henry Knox ascending to command over the artillery by the Battle of Yorktown in October of 1781, the artillery of the Continental Army was so impressive that the Marquis de Lafayette called it, quote, one of the wonders of the Revolution. So again, here's an individual that because of his father abandoning them at 9, going to the bookbindery, setting up his own bookstore, John Adams being a patron, gets into the army, and how God, no coincidences. These are God incidences, okay? Celebrating Knox's roles in America's eventual triumph at Yorktown, Washington reported to Congress that the young general's, quote, genius supplied the deficit of means. Now, what does that mean? It means that the U.S. colonial army was poor. Now, you know the pictures of Valley Forge. They didn't have shoes, right? The people died on the march because they were so open to the inclement weather. They didn't have anything that was really needed as of a professional army. So he says here, that General Knox's genius supplied the deficit of means. In other words, what he was able to do by going up to Ticonderoga and get cannons that were already up there, bringing them back and helping to save Boston. Can you imagine if Boston had been overrun by the British had taken over that town, what would have happened? The American Revolution's over, okay? Because that is such an important place where the patriots were meeting. Remember in week 1 when we took a look at the prayer that saved the American colonies, all of that was going on there was at the Old South Church in Boston. And then when they prepared for the Tea Party, they were meeting in the Old South Church of Boston. This was the hub of the Patriots' activity. So if God had not intervened and the British were able to come and take that town with their massive soldiers and artillery and everything, which they would have easily done, okay, because of just the overpowering nature of what they had compared to what we had, the American Revolution's done before it starts. That's part of the miracle of what transpired. After which Washington promoted Knox to be the Army's youngest major general and finally commander. In 1785, Knox was chosen as the nation's second Secretary of War under President Washington. Why don't we hit that last picture if we could? Now here obviously is George Washington, and right there is Henry Knox. That's Alexander. Okay, so Henry Knox becomes the Secretary of War. Alexander Hamilton becomes Secretary of the Treasury. Thomas Jefferson becomes Secretary of State. Edmund Randolph becomes the Attorney General. The only one that's missing from here is the Vice President, John Adams. But these will be the chief confidants to the newly elected or positioned President George Washington. In all, Henry Knox fought in the battles of Dorchester Heights, the New York Campaign, which is next week, which is one of the biggies, and that's the Battle of what? Anybody know what it is? What is the Battle of New York? The Battle of Long Island, or called what? That's your homework assignment. Look it up. I do this every Thursday. I always give them an assignment. Look it up. Look it up. That's your assignment. Look up the Battle of Long Island, what it's called. And New Jersey campaign, he was at Trenton. He was at Princeton. Check this out. Henry Knox arranged Washington's crossing of the Delaware. He was also with the Philadelphia campaign, Germantown, Monmouth, and Yorktown. In other words, he was at every major battle that George Washington was at. As Secretary of War, this is impressive. As Secretary of War, Knox developed a plan for a national military, setting a precedent that guided the new nation's military training for more than 1.5 centuries. The plan that Henry Knox put in for a national military, his plan, remember back in that book bindery, where from 9 years old, he's reading Julius Caesar's commentaries. He's reading all of this about war. He was so drawn to war, warfare, topography and all. I wonder why he was drawn to that. Maybe God had a plan that he was putting into play, okay? With respect to General Knox, George Washington wrote, this is impressive also, quote, "There is no man in the United States with whom I have been in habits of, there we go. I'm going to start again. Quote, "There is no man in the United States with whom I have been in habits of greater intimacy, no one whom I have loved more sincerely, nor any for whom I have a greater friendship." How many of you before tonight knew little or nothing of Henry Knox? Right? I mean, who's Henry Knox? George Washington said that he's saying here he's the most important person to me in this whole campaign. Okay? This stupendous feat of logistics and the timely, violent storm led to what George Washington described as, quote, a most remarkable interposition of providence. In other words, a God incident, as he looked back and saw just this whole thing with Henry Knox. Okay, let me hand out something to you at this point. Grace, would you hand one of these to everybody? Because this is the sheet that I give out weekly, which is a summation to help you to be able to remember what's the most important parts of this. Remembering God's miracle, week 3. Now, as I shared, actually this is the 4th miracle, and some would say even 5 because of the 2 working together. But we'll have way over a dozen by the end of week 12, okay? Remembering God's miracles, week 3. The relationship developed between George Washington and Henry Knox. A, they met because of John Adams in the bookstore, coming in and out, and how he's so impressed that he would recommend him to George Washington. B, further cemented because of Knox's idea and executed to save Boston, going up to Fort Ticonderoga, getting the cannons, bringing them back in the nick of time. Little A, bringing the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. And then B, George Washington said, there is no man, this is said after the war, there is no man in the United States with whom I have been in habits of greater intimacy, no one whom I have loved more sincerely, nor any for whom I have a greater friendship. Point 2, if we do our best, and this is so important because I learned this a long time ago, if we do our best, God will aid us in the accomplishment of the act if we are on God's side concerning the act. Now that goes back to a quote from Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln was asked by someone under him, said, President Lincoln, do you think that God is on our side in this campaign, quote, the Civil War? And Abraham Lincoln responded, son, I'm not concerned if God is on our side. I'm only concerned, are we on God's side? See, that's a big difference there. Are we on God's side? And that's why I say these, you'll see war after war, these people had to give everything. No fear of death. They had to give everything to whatever they were doing. And then all of a sudden, God would look favorably upon the situation and show up with a fog, with rain, with snow, with something going on that would each time enable the American Revolution to go further along. And we'll see that in the weeks to come as we go along. Second page. Think back to week 1 and how God saved the American colonies from Nova Scotia to Georgia. If the British had taken control of Boston in 1776, it would have totally reshaped the future of British control in America. A British Boston foothold would have been devastating to any future American independence. Then a twofold miracle. Henry Knox was able to accomplish the feat during winter and arrived just in time to install the cannons at the moment Britain was going to attack. Point B, the next day, a severe storm, a nor'easter, stopped the British from being able to attack from the sea. The storm lasted several days, allowing the colonists to fortify their artillery positions even further, though they wouldn't need them. Point C, George Washington called the event, referring to both Henry Knox's ability to get the cannons there and the nor'easter that showed up right at the right moment, which totally disillusioned the British to the fact that they decided, let's go back to England, we'll fight another day. George Washington called the event a, quote, most remarkable interposition of providence that saved the Continental Army from a disastrous assault or a disastrous result. Well, thank you for those of you at home for being with us tonight. We're going to be back next week for the Battle of Long Island, but it's up to you to look up for the more common name of that. See you next week. God bless you. All right.